This is the Boiling Point with James Conway and Tenacious Tex Dozier here.
That's right. Hey, how y'all doing out there? We're going to have a special guest on today. We have the executive director of the Cato Institute, libertarian think tank, coming on in a couple minutes. He has a new book out called The Politics of Freedom, taking on the left, the right, and the threats to our liberties. It's always he's a fresh voice in the political circus that is America, and he wrote the book in 1997, Libertarianism, a Primer. He's a co-editor of Cato Handbook on Policy and the Cato Handbook for Congress. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, National Review, and Slate. He's been on ABC's Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, CNN's Crossfire, NPR's Talk of the Nation, and All Things Considered, including Fox News, BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, you name it. He has been on it, a graduate of Vanderbilt University. Mr. David Boaz. Mr. Boaz, how you doing, sir?
Fine, thank you.
Well, Mr. Boaz, it's a pleasure to have you on today. I picked up your book yesterday, and I recommend everyone else to pick it up. Even if you're, a Democrat or Republican, it lets you have a fresh face on politics that is America today. And just to start things out, in the book, in March 1998, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times concerning the war on drugs, an article that you included in the new book. As much as I agree with your rationale concerning the impracticality of this war's implementation, you cite in the article that, quote, the most dangerous drugs in the U.S. are alcohol, which is responsible for about 100,000 deaths a year, and tobacco, which is responsible for about 350,000 deaths a year. Heroin and cocaine and marijuana account for a total of 36,000 deaths a year. 3,600 deaths a year, I'm sorry. Couldn't someone respond noting the correlation between legality and fatality, that you're opening the barn door with legislation? When Prohibition occurred, they might say the number of alcoholics dropped substantially and increased afterwards. And, as much as I think Prohibition's crazy myself, and since you support the legalization of drugs like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, where do you draw the line? Is that a line based on cost, benefit, and consideration of third-party consequence? Where's the line drawn on what should be legalized?
Well, first you should read the rest of the sentence so we can see that the numbers wouldn't change very much. Heroin and cocaine and marijuana account for a total of 3,600 deaths a year, even though 1 in 5 people ages 20 to 40 uses drugs. So even if we legalized these drugs and there was a substantial increase in their use, we wouldn't see anything like 100,000 deaths. They're simply not as lethal as the currently legal drugs. For me, the important line to draw is what is the role of government and what are the rights of the individuals. And I can't see anything more personal, more intimate, more obviously a right of the individual than deciding what to put in your own body, whether that is alcohol or tobacco or cocaine. That ought to be a choice left up to the individual. And we can talk about the cost-benefit analysis for each drug or all drugs, but it seems to me we ought to start from the principle that the government shouldn't tell you whether you can eat a ham sandwich or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd say that I agree with this position to some extent. But would you say there's a difference between legalization and decriminalization, for instance? I mean, personally,
no doubt there is, but I've never met two people who understand those terms the same way. So let me just say, what I believe is that there should not be legal penalties for adults making choices about their own lives with regard to what to eat, drink, or smoke. So obviously some people disagree, and there are ways to move in that direction. Some people, when they say decriminalization, mean, well, there would still be a fine for it. Well, okay, I mean, a fine is better than a jail term, but I don't see why the government should be allowed to penalize you because you decide to smoke marijuana instead of tobacco.
Right, and the war on drugs is just as infeasible as the war on terror, correct? Impractical.
I'm not sure I'm gonna make that exact analogy. I'm just going to say I think Prohibition failed in the 1920s, and you're there in Chicago. You know about a lot of the failures, the Al Capone and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Crime rates went up dramatically during Prohibition, and they went down every year after Prohibition. Crime rates also went up during the intensification of drug prohibition, and they have come down somewhat, and that may partly be because some of the worst drugs we stopped. Some of the worst drugs proved to be dangerous, and people stopped using them, and that reduced a lot of the money that was involved there. But the fact is that crime rates are still higher than they ought to be, and a lot of that crime is a reflection not of the use of drugs, but of the prohibition of drugs.
Well, in the book, you also talk about, I mean, you bring up the nanny state, you bring up the welfare state, you bring up the police state, and this, you just go off on government, and I believe you correctly go off on government on infringing upon our liberties. And in the book's introduction, you cite Al Smith's famous line, "Nobody shoots at Santa Claus," to point to the lack of fiscal accountability in the wayward two-party supported welfare state. Now, is there any hope for the American taxpayer in the future? I mean, is there anyone that's going to advocate for the American taxpayer? And moreover, if programs are not just reformed, like welfare to workfare, but these programs are completely absolved from the government, what are true solutions to the problems of the disadvantaged economically in our society?
Well, I have some essays on that in the book, so I urge people to get the book. I also urge people to look at the Cato Institute website for more in-depth discussion of all of these kinds of problems. Is there any hope for the taxpayers? Well, we clearly are on a path right now where, although we have officially cut taxes under the Bush administration, we have radically increased spending, and that means in the long run somebody's going to have to pay for that, and if it's not my generation, then it may be your generation. But what we've seen in a lot of other countries around the world is that you finally reform these programs when you face a precipice, when there's no choice left. And for better or worse, the American economy has remained so strong that we haven't faced that precipice. We have not had to reform. We've been able to continue piling on more entitlements. President Bush came to office claiming that he was going to trust you, not the government. He was going to slow the growth of government, and instead he created this huge new prescription drug entitlement, which is going to cost trillions of dollars.
Lovely, compassionate conservatism right there.
Well, compassionate to some people, certainly not to the taxpayers, not to the people who will be looking for jobs as the $16 trillion unfunded liability heads down the road. Yes, we will get control of this because we're not completely insane, and at some point people will realize we can't afford this. We may be coming to some sort of realization. The Democratic candidates are promising to raise taxes because they're calling Bush profligate, they're talking about the unbalanced budget, and they're promising huge new spending programs. So they at least are being honest enough to say, we will raise taxes. I don't think the American people want to raise taxes. They may well want to elect Barack Obama president, but I don't believe they want taxes raised. And so we may have a crisis early in the next administration about what do we do to get control of soaring deficits if people don't want their taxes raised. Maybe we will have an opportunity at that point to really discuss this. But absolutely, one of my colleagues has estimated that there is a $62 trillion unfunded liability facing younger Americans. Now, even at the University of Chicago, there is no one who can comprehend $62 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So that's one of the reasons you get away with it. It is easier to talk about the $1 million earmark for the Woodstock Museum.
Right.
People understand that.
Right.
$62 trillion.
Yeah.
Who can understand it? But there will be some people in Washington who do, and others who will understand, well, we have this huge deficit. Apparently, the political system doesn't want a tax increase. What are we going to do now?